little bit today about the second section of the Origins of Totalitarianism, which is, as you know, entitled Imperialism. And I'm going to suggest, as I said a little earlier, that this is really the core of the book. The first part of the book on anti-Semitism is important for a number of reasons. Arendt says that she makes it much longer than it should be because she just wants to document that, remember she's writing this in the late 40s, publishes it in 1950. There's just not much that has been done on it. And let's be honest, there are very few people who have the linguistic and other abilities that she had to read all these different sources and compile them. And so she really, the anti-Semitism part, most of it is as much documenting history as it is making her argument. And that said, there are important parts of it, and she doesn't want to deny that anti-Semitism actually played a role. She thinks it did. But in the end, it's not entirely clear if you try and actually understand from her arguments in that section, in that first chapter, what the role of anti-Semitism was in totalitarianism. It's not so clear. First of all, because it wasn't apparent in the Soviet Union, which she thinks is also a totalitarian government. I have arguments about that. I mean, in essence, what she wants to say is that anti-Semitism played a role insofar as it played into this idea of equality, social equality that emerged, and Jews and their claim of specialness or difference gave the lie to liberal equality, and thus led to anti-Semitism in a certain sense. But, she doesn't have, I think, and no one, as far as I know, has made a clear analysis of the anti-Semitism section, and its role in the book is important and yet not as central, I would argue, as the chapter on imperialism. The chapter on imperialism is really the core of her argument about the origins of totalitarianism more generally. And she says this. I'm going to again quote the original Harvest HVJ edition, which is what I use. I don't know, because I'm used to it. She says on page Roman numeral 21, so in the preface, "This book deals only with the strictly European colonial imperialism, whose end came with the liquidation of British rule in India. It tells the story of the disintegration of the nation-state that proved to contain nearly all the elements necessary for the subsequent rise of totalitarian movements and governments. It is the attack on the nation-state, which has its roots in imperialism, that contains nearly all the elements necessary for totalitarianism." She says on page 222, "Nazism and Bolshevism owe more to pan-Germanism and pan-Slavism, respectively, namely pan-movements, imperialist movements, than any other ideology or political movement." And you can read there, anti-Semitism or Marxism. So more than any other ideology or movement, totalitarian governments, Nazism and Bolshevism, owe more to pan movements, to these imperialist movements that we're discussing in this chapter. The book is about the elements of totalitarianism, and there are a number of elements. I don't want to say there's only one. I would say the most important overarching theme in the book, and one that continues to emerge and dominate her work throughout her entire career, are what she calls in this book ruthlessness, homelessness, and loneliness. To sort of map these three ideas come back throughout the entire book. To map them would be an incredible project. Basically, it's the experience of rootlessness, of the loss of a sense of place that is very much a feeling of our 20th century. But also she talks about sometimes a metaphysical rootlessness or a metaphysical homelessness, which is not just about the fact that we no longer live in shtetls or in small villages, but that we seem to have lost our sense of place or meaning in the world, in the sense that there used to be traditions and ancestors and religions and even nation states that we belonged to that gave us a sense of meaning and purpose, and we've lost those. And we're adrift. And this is a theme that she comes back. She takes it from her teacher, Martin Heidegger, and she comes back to over and over again throughout her life. And it's in response to this loneliness and rootlessness for Arendt that we are so prone to turn to things that give life meaning, like movements, whether it's Nazism or the environmental movement. Now obviously there's a big difference. One is a totalitarian movement and one we hope is not. But the point is, movements attract us because they give us a kind of identity, a sense of purpose and meaning in the life, because we no longer have that home or rootedness, and we are lonely in this sense, which doesn't mean solitude, and I'm not going to talk about that right now, but something that is important. So rootlessness and homelessness are one of the core elements. Anti-Semitism is one particular movement that, as she said, was a catalyst in this particular case, in the case of Nazism. The breakdown of law and the rise of terror and the loss of the nation state, these are all other elements of the rise of totalitarianism. But what I want to suggest is that almost all of these, in her reading, have their roots in imperialism. And so imperialism really is the core of the book. What is imperialism, and why is imperialism so important? Well, in its essence, she has a very, let's call it, clear and particular definition of imperialism, which is its expansion. So you all, I'm sure, read the Cecil Rhodes quote, "Expansion is everything," he said. And that is for her very much at the root of what imperialism is. This idea that it's expansion plays into another theme that Arendt carries through this book, and again through all of her work, which is the lack of limits, or the attack on limits. Imperialism is a kind of politics which explodes all limits. And in this case, most clearly the limit of the nation state, of borders. It's thus a breach of the nation state. And one of the fascinating sub-theses of this book is, in a certain way, a defense of the nation state, which is not the same thing as a lot of us mean by a nation state, but there is a sense in which she thinks that while it's not the only and best, at this point in our lives, it's an important idea to hold on to. Although she also flirts at times with this idea of federalism and other arrangements. But it's a real, one of the great causes of totalitarianism is the breach of the nation state. A fourth answer to the problem of imperialism, and it's one that Kathy just mentioned and I'm going to talk a bit about, is this idea of the loss of the idea of humanity. And to me, this is one of the really often overlooked and most important theses and ideas of the book, and especially this section. The fifth is that this loss of idea of humanity, which she traces to imperialism and to Thomas Hobbes, is the precondition for racism, which, as I'm sure you know, is distinguished from race thinking. And then the sixth is the rise of administration of foreign peoples in the imperialist movement, which led to the rise of bureaucracy and the loss of law. So these are six different parts of, or results of imperialism that I'm going to suggest all relate to imperialism in a way that roots totalitarianism in imperialism. I'm going to focus most of my attention today on the very first chapter of the, or first, I never know what to call them, the first chapter of the Imperialism section, which is called the Political Emancipation of the Bourgeoisie. If I have time, and you guys bear with me, I can do a quick excursus of the rest of the book, of the chapter on imperialism. After that, I mean, I'll be very honest with you, I teach an entire course on this book, so 14 weeks, and I spend 7 weeks on imperialism. So 14 class sessions on the imperialism section. So to do it in an hour is not something I look forward to. It's the first time I'm ever going to try it, and we'll see how I do. That said, so because of that, I know I'm going to at times skip over a lot of very difficult material, and I'm happy to be interrupted, and I'm happy to have you ask questions. I usually teach Socratically, so I'm happy to deal with questions. On page 123, again, of the Harvest edition, Arendt, in this chapter on the emancipation of the bourgeoisie, says, the central inner European event of the imperialism period was the political emancipation of the bourgeoisie, which up to then had been the first class in history to achieve economic preeminence without aspiring to political rule. So this is right before section 1. This is on the first page of the bourgeoisie.
167.
167 in the Samantha Power edition. So we should take this seriously. The central event of imperialism, at least in Europe, is the rise of the bourgeoisie and its emancipation into politics. The political emancipation. Why did the bourgeoisie typically not engage in politics? Well, for a very simple reason. They had other and better things to do. Namely, make money and raise a family. Right? A good bourgeois person, man, raises money. Makes money and concerns himself with his private position and interest. And a good bourgeois woman, if you have this sort of gendered construct, raises a family. And together, they concern themselves with their little world. Their main political concern is for security. Both physical security and the security to raise their family and make their money. And that's what the bourgeoisie want. And so this is why the classic form of government for bourgeois, in a bourgeois age, is representative government. Namely, it's the kind of outsourcing of government to representatives. Instead of us having to spend time on government, we vote once every 4 years, or more or less, and we let someone else do it for us. This is one of the reasons Arendt sees representative government as deeply anti-political, because it basically says government is not important enough for us to spend our time on. And so this is for her the classical bourgeois mentality. So why did the bourgeoisie in the imperialist age, which again she dates from 1884 to 1914, why did the bourgeoisie emancipate itself? Well, get into politics. I think you know the answer, but to give it, it's that the bourgeoisie were very happy to make money and raise their families, but at some point they needed new markets. They were running out of markets. She actually takes very much Rosa Luxemburg's argument about how capitalism always needs non-capitalist places and sectors, and says they needed new markets. I'm sorry, could someone just pass that iced tea up to me? Someone needed something to drink. And she says that since they needed these markets, they went into them, and they started doing business in Africa and in other countries that were often not with the same kind of strong governments that Western Europe had. And they found that sometimes, people would come and take away their property, or there were wars to be fought, or people didn't like the fact that they were mining all the trees and taking them back to Europe, or something like this. And so they said, well, let's bring our armies, into the imperialist movement and engage in commerce backed by the army. And so the bourgeoisie got involved in politics in order to help with its economic endeavors and to expand overseas. She has some wonderful pages, I think, about the imperialist movement, and I encourage you to read them, but I don't want to say much more about that. But the overall thesis here, again, is the disintegration of the nation state. And so how does imperialism lead to the disintegration of the nation state? Well, remember, the core thought of imperialism is expansion is everything. And you keep expanding, right? Well, the English Empire covered the whole world. And that was the goal of empires in general. And the stronger and the bigger your empire, the stronger your country was, the richer it was, and the more powerful it was. She compares two different types of empire on page 125 thereabouts, which again is in section 1 of this on expansion of the nation state. The Roman Empire and the modern empire. And some of you know your Roman history. In Roman history, when Rome would conquer a new area, a new city-state, it would allow that city-state to continue to operate on its old law, and it would simply integrate them into a Roman Empire, but they would remain different. They would remain Carthaginian or Greek or whatever, but they would just also pay a tithe to and have loyalty to Rome. And it could do that because each different city had its own law, and the Roman Empire was not based on everybody following the same law. Was not based on an idea of common assimilation. The modern empire, as Arendt understood it, was based on nation states. And she takes the definition of nation state from someone named Renan, a French political theorist at the time, historian and political theorist. Ernst Renan, yeah. And she says that the essence of a modern nation state is governance and legitimacy by consent. Right? We consent to be governed. The problem with consent is that if you consent to your laws, if you have, English people and Indian people and South African people, you might not consent to the same laws. And so you could either, like the Romans, leave them to their own laws, but that's not, then it's hard to have an integrated modern nation state, or you can assimilate them. And assimilating them means, to a certain degree, tyrannizing them, bringing them to have English laws, or German laws, or Belgian laws in some way. And so the need of the modern empire is assimilation, whereas the Roman Empire could get away with integration of plural peoples. And this was a problem, because you couldn't really just go and assimilate all these people. And then so you would create these hybrid situations where you'd have, India be a little different, but not completely different. British administered, but not under the same laws of Britain. And this led to a whole host of problems, again, which she talks about. But the point that she wants to make here, and that I want to emphasize, is that the deepest desire of imperialism is the expansion of political power. And in a nation state, the expansion of political power should expand the body politic, and yet you can't expand the body politic because they're very different. And what this leads to, in her argument on pages 135 to 137, is the destruction of the body politic. It actually works back to destroy not the imperialist, bounties, not India and Africa, but it works back to destroy the politics of the nation states in Europe. Well, how did it do so? Why did it do so? So just, what she says on page 137 is that it leads to the destruction of the body politic and the destruction of all living communities. It's an extraordinary claim. She says that imperialism is opposed to all stabilizing forces which stand in the way of constant transformation and expansion. Why? Why does imperialism destroy all stabilizing forces? Why does it destroy all living communities? Well, because the overarching desire of imperialism is the desire of its dominant class, the bourgeoisie, which is power. Power, the one power, she says, is on page, I didn't actually write it down, 137, 138, is the one publicly honored principle of the bourgeoisie. It is the only thing that the bourgeoisie needs and wants. Power. Now, power, of course, brings with it money, status, and other things, but it's power that the bourgeois wants. And she traces this to someone unexpected at this point in the book, who she then goes on a long digression on, and that is Thomas Hobbes. And this is somewhat surprising. I mean, for those of us who read Arendt, she never really comes back to Hobbes later in her work. I mean, maybe here or there a little bit, but this is the only sustained treatment of Thomas Hobbes that I know of in her oeuvre. And it's deeply important to her reading, and I think it's not a normal take on Thomas Hobbes, and so I want to talk a little bit about it. She says that Thomas Hobbes is the great thinker of power and the great thinker of bourgeois man. A couple of quotes. The desire for power must be the fundamental passion of the bourgeois man, from Thomas Hobbes. Man is, quote, a power-thirsty animal. Man is a being that desires power after power. Reason is nothing but reckoning. Now, think about what that means. Reason is nothing but reckoning. For those of us who know a little bit of the history of philosophy, who is Thomas Hobbes arguing against? Man is a reckoning being, or man is a reckoning animal. Right? Aristotle, many, many years ago, defines man as a rational animal. Kant says that man is a vernünftige Lebewesen, a rational living being. Hobbes is before Kant, but what he's arguing here is something incredibly radical. That whereas throughout most of philosophy, from Aristotle through Kant, the Western tradition has understood man as rational, as pursuing reason, as pursuing truth of some sort. Hobbes says no, man pursues power, and he reckons for what will get to power and what will not. He doesn't reason. He doesn't seek to reason. This is a radical claim, and it's one that has had an enormous impact. Not to say that Hobbes makes it happen, but Hobbes is reflective of, and also I think enabling of, in a double way, of the replacement of reason with power in contemporary, in the last 200 or 300 years of Western society and Western civilization. So that Hobbes can say, in Book 1, Chapter 10, quoted by Arendt on 139, a free will or a subject is without meaning, without, quote, a capacity for truth. A free will has no capacity for truth, has no aim or end except the pursuit of his interests, the acquisition of power. There is no ability to find meaning in the world. There is no meaning in the world. There's no reason to the world. All there is the pursuit of interests, not the pursuit of meaning or reason. Do you want to ask something? No.
Brenda.
I just,
Yeah.
could you give us Hobbes is a man of words. How would you define reckoning, the true definition of reckoning? I just wanted
Yeah.
to
So by reckoning, he means calculating. Now, we have, one of the funny things or difficult things in philosophy is that there's a word reason, which comes from ratio, which means to reckon. You have, in Latin, reason comes from ratio. In Greek and German, that's not the case. So in Greek, you have nous, is the kind of mind. In German, you have Vernunft, the perfection of nous, of knowledge. Whereas reckoning is something, Raten, something very different. Raten or calculation. And Latin is the vocabulary in which reason and reckoning get combined. But in any case, in this situation, Arendt is pointing to a transformation from reason in its sort of more classical sense of thinking without calculating, insight into the world, into the truth, versus simply making calculations and saying there is no truth, all there is advantage, right? Which is what Hobbes argues. Is that clear? So the first part of Arendt's reading of Hobbes is that Hobbes is actually not describing man so much as he's describing bourgeois man. This new man that is emerging in the 17th century through the 19th century, and Hobbes is writing in the mid to late 17th century. The second part of her reading of Hobbes is that actually it's less a theory of man, or even a bourgeois man, and more a kind of theory of bourgeois man as the man who is fit for a particular kind of politics, namely the security state or the stable state. What he's really describing is the kind of man who will exist in a state that offers security. Not a state that offers meaning, not a state that offers greatness, not a state that offers triumph or nobility, but one that offers security, which is what bourgeois men want. We want to be let to do our thing, let be to do our thing. And so it's a kind of state, she says, in which the public is defined by a loss of meaning, and the public, in a sense, gives way to the private, which becomes much more important. It's the kind of state of representative government. And as many of you may know, the frontispiece, the cover of Hobbes' Leviathan, is a picture of the Leviathan with all the faces of the people inside of it. It is the great book of representative government. Mm-hmm. And so, the idea here is that bourgeois man seeks representative government in which public life is diminished and given over to representatives so that the important parts of life in our private world, namely our income and our families, we can pursue on our own. For Hobbes, then the third element is this, of Hobbes' thought that Arendt points to, is that the final end of man, the point then, of what man is not to find truth or reason or meaning, but simply to institute a power over himself that protects his right to expand his own private power, namely the Leviathan, or representative government. And she says there's a funny paradox here, which is that we seek security because we want power. And power is about the constant movement, the constant increase of our wealth, the constant increase of our power. And yet the way to attain power is to find a community that will, in a sense, provide stability for the private realm. And so she says, a community based solely on power must decay in the calm and order of stability. So there's a certain kind of tension in what Hobbes and the bourgeoisie want. On the one hand, we want security. On the other hand, there must be a kind of tension. And so then the fourth element is that for Hobbes, and here she says as well as Cecil Rhodes, quote, on page 144, the human condition and the limitations of the globe were a serious obstacle to a process that was unable to stop and to stabilize, and could therefore only begin by a series of destructive catastrophes once it had reached these limits. So think about it. If your goal is infinite and never-ending accumulation of power, lots of things stand in your way. One is Christianity and all moral systems. Christianity stands in your way because it tells you you can't charge interest, or you can't kill people, or you can't do bad things to people, if you know, depending on how you read Christianity. And so all the moral limitations of Christianity stand in the way of the pursuit of power. The books of the ancients, right? The virtues stand in the way. And of course, nations stand in the way, borders, because they tell you that you're allowed to do what you want in your country, but you're not allowed to go and do what you want in another country. And so we need to expand beyond our own borders and reach these limits. And then the fifth thing that Hobbes says is that we should justify tyranny. He says such a thing. He says, the name of tyranny, and she quotes this on 144, signifieth nothing more nor less than the name of sovereignty, right? Which he's in favor of. Tyranny is simply sovereignty. And he says also, I think the toleration of professed hatred of tyranny is a toleration of hatred to the Commonwealth in general. To hate tyranny is to hate the Commonwealth, is to hate all politics. We should give the Commonwealth the sovereign power to do whatever it needs to protect peoples in their pursuit of more power. So this is her reading of Hobbes, and it's a deeply, deeply important reading of Hobbes, because what it's saying is that Hobbes provides the philosophical grounding for a limitless philosophy, for a philosophy of acquisition that has no end, that has no limits. That was the philosophy of the bourgeoisie, which led to imperialism. Now, that's just the step one of the argument, right? And it's the first chapter of the argument. But it's an important one, and if you can, just turn to the last pages of this chapter on the emancipation of the bourgeoisie, because she comes back to Hobbes here. And it's on 157 in my edition, but you can find it. It's on the last page.
208 and 9.
So she says on 208 probably then, the philosophy of Hobbes, it is true, contains nothing of modern race doctrines, which not only stir up the mob, but in their totalitarian form, outline very clearly the forms of organization through which humanity could carry the endless process of capital and power accumulation through to its logical end in self-destruction. So, Hobbes was not a racist. He wasn't an ideology. I mean, there are people who want to go back and read all the philosophers and find racism in them, and you can do that, including Arendt. That's not the point. He wasn't an ideological racist in the sense that Arendt means by racist. There's no modern race doctrines. There's no sense that one people is pseudo-scientifically and ideologically superior and has a right to rule over all others. But But, she says, Hobbes at least provided political thought with the prerequisite for all race doctrines. That is, the exclusion in principle of the idea of humanity. The exclusion in principle of the idea of humanity, which constitutes the sole regulating idea of international law. So what you see here is Hobbes provides the prerequisite for all race doctrines, namely ideologies, modern race doctrines, because it excludes in principle the idea of humanity. Why does it exclude in principle the idea of humanity? Now we read back into what we just read. Because the idea of humanity says that all human beings have a common origin. In Christianity, that common origin is God, creation by God as equal souls. In philosophy, it was, we're all rational beings. We have reason. We're rational animals. What Hobbes says is, no, we're not. There is no such thing as a rational animal. We are power-thirsty. We are animals that want to win, that want to gain more. What that means is that I want me and my people, my family or my nation or my race, to gain more. And I'm willing to do anything to anyone else. I'm willing to kill all the wolves or chop down all the trees or kill all the Jews or, enslave all the blacks, whatever it is, to do what I'm doing, because as a human being, I'm not a rational member of a common human species. I'm a power-seeking member of my group. And so she says that the Hobbesian philosophy is a philosophy that attacks the idea of a common humanity. And in attacking an idea of a kind of humanity, it allows for, even though it itself was not a race doctrine, it allows for then someone to say, my race deserves to be higher than your race. If only by chance, and if only by the fact that we're winning. But we deserve it, and we can do anything to accomplish it. It's a matter of reckoning. Including imperialistically bringing our armies into other countries and killing people, exterminating them, selling their resources, etc. And so this first chapter on the political emancipation of the bourgeoisie is about the philosophical, is about one, the idea of expansion politically as the idea brought to politics by the bourgeoisie, and two, about the philosophical origins of this idea of expansion in the bourgeoisie in the work of Thomas Hobbes. Together, these two ideas lead to, well, in the sense of expansion, the challenge to the nation state, and in the sense of the prerequisite to race doctrines and the challenge to the idea of humanity, the rise of race doctrines, and eventually to the highest insight of totalitarian government that takes this to its end, which is that everything is possible and everything is allowed, or everything is permitted. These are the foundations, the intellectual foundations of it in this first chapter. The rest of the imperialism section pretty much does all that work. And I'm going to go through it in a second. But are there any questions that people have